Hello, everyone. Good morning. Thank you so much for joining us today. Before we kick things off with our wonderful panelists this morning, allow me to very quickly introduce myself. My name is Melisa Idris. I'm a senior editor with Astro Awani News Network, where I host a nightly news talk show called Consider This, as well as another one on weekends called The Future's Female. Now, I'm so delighted to be here with you this morning at the Hasanah Forum. I mean, for those who attended yesterday, there was a lot of discussion about how, as a country, we are at a very crucial point in our journey of nationhood. And that, this is where we decide what kind of country we want to be, what kind of society we want to be. So this panel is absolutely timely and, an important conversation to have over the next 90 minutes or so. We're going to be hearing from youth leaders about what kind of future they are fighting for. I mean, let's hear from them themselves, their vision, their strategies for working on kind of community-led solutions to advance social justice in this country. So I'd like to invite, each of the panelists. We've got a wonderful collection of youth leaders and people working very diligently on issues close to their hearts. So I'd like to invite each of them to introduce themselves and maybe tell us a little bit about the cause or the causes that they are championing. So panelists, good morning. Welcome to this session. I'm going to invite each of you to talk a little bit about the work that you do and what you and your organization hopes to achieve through that work. I'm going to begin with Tharma Pillai, co-founder and advocacy director of UNDI 18. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Melissa. Always a pleasure to speak, in a forum or an interview with you. Although I think this time is a bit more chill than most of the normal sessions, right? So firstly, thank you very much for the opportunity to Yayasan Hasanah. I think it's always a great program that they're organizing to discuss these key issues. So my name is Tharma. I'm the advocacy director and co-founder for UNDI 18. UNDI 18 is a youth movement that advocated in the past to lower the voting age in Malaysia from 21 years old to 18 years old. In 2019, we were very lucky that as a result from the work that we did, we achieved a historic constitutional amendment with 100% of votes in Dewan Rakyat and Dewan Negara in order to bring voting rights to about 7.8 million new voters by GE 15, which is supposed to be 2023. So it is a big change in our democratic sphere, and it will mean that more young people have the right, and most importantly, we have the power and the influence over our democratic process. I think that's something that was quite important for us to advocate for, and I think right now, in terms of the kind of work that we do, we realize that we've already brought in the right to vote. So the next step must be to ensure that more young voters vote as informed voters, as educated voters, as responsible voters, right? That is also an important part of democracy, right? Not just having access or the right to do something, but also to do so in a responsible manner, in an informed manner. So I think for us right now, we are focusing more on education. We're focusing more on building a cohort of young leaders and champions for various issues, whether it is democratic processes, whether it is for women's rights and representations, whether it is fighting for a more equal and just society with institutions that can fix certain issues, but also in terms of pushing for things such as policies that reduce our impacts towards the environment and that can fight back against climate change. I think these are key issues that myself and my organization are working towards. Sorry, should I just go for my vision towards Malaysia 2020 or is that not yet?
Well, we can save that to the end, and that's an hour and 30 minutes to discuss. So sure. We'll come back to your vision, but I take your point about you've achieved this historic, wonderful constitutional amendment to allow 18-year-olds to give 18-year-olds the right to vote. But then I guess the question is what's next and what we need to achieve, and that's what we're going to discuss in the coming panel discussion. Okay, let's move on to Nadiah Dzulfakar. She's the chairperson of Klima Action Malaysia, or better known as KAMI. Nadiah, tell us a little bit about the work that you're doing through KAMI.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me. speaking together with a line of extraordinary young thinkers and shakers here in Malaysia. My name is Nadiah. I'm from Klima Action Malaysia. We are a climate justice group based on feminist principles to mobilize climate emergency declaration here in Malaysia. So we were practically born in the streets of Kuala Lumpur during the last global climate strikes in 2019. I think we might be the youngest group here, just a little over 2 years. Most of us, young people who came down on the streets at that point, we are really much aware of the climate impacts that is already happening, but we sort of fail to anticipate the gravity of climate inaction in this country. So you say we use the term climate crisis now to denote the urgency, and that the climate crisis, what we understand right now, is very systemic in nature. And that is why the global and local movement that we have here in Malaysia has to pivot to demand actions that treat the crisis in an urgent and just way, with putting intersectionality at its core rather than just addressing the symptoms. And this is why I think the solutions that we have as being proposed by policymakers, they are very symptomatic in nature. It only addresses the superficial responses to how do we deal with climate, but we don't really ask, why it had happened. So, and this is particularly urgent because right now the world is not only facing a climate crisis, we are facing multiple tipping points. We are battling the global pandemic. So this pandemic has exposed and exacerbated all this systemic oppression and the injustice that rakyat all over the world has endured. And at the center of our work is intersectionality within the climate movement. With the intensifying impacts, climate impacts, and along with it inaction, we can no longer ignore the systemic injustice that has led to this crisis of loss and damage, climate migration, displacement, human rights, gender justice, climate reparation, debt, and one of the most important words, language, colonization. Okay, these are the issues that should be at the heart of climate conversations. We have seen this at COP, and it's being pushed aside to side events. We need this sort of issues to be addressed because when we talk about just transition, we are talking about transformational transition of the people. But still, these kind of issues are still underrepresented and completely missing from the discourse in policymaking in this country. But however, the civil society and the grassroots movement organizations are already leading this discussion, either nationally, regionally, and also at these spaces. This is where the bulk of the work are being done. And it's right now being led by the people who are already impacted by the climate crisis. So this is what I think, the work that we, as a young organization, are heavily invested in. We are invested in coalition building, movement building, because we know that we can't afford to work in silos, and especially in this pandemic where we have seen resources shrinking, democratic spaces shrinking. We need those sort of networking to help each other. And also in our work, we confront institutional patriarchy, racism, and that is through the prioritization of women's leadership, gender justice, and centering human rights in policy making and public discourse. To describe the patriarchal and male-dominated power structures. So these are the underlying currents that is missing in such discourses, and also providing spaces for Indigenous or vulnerable community leadership, because we need to systematically confront that exploitative and unsustainable production patterns that have been the driver of our country's economy. And the last bit, which is, we want to strengthen the institutional framework, and that is the right to climate information. I think this is really important because climate information goes beyond education per se. So this is the bulk of work that our organization is doing right now in order to pave way for a much better future and a just transition. Yeah.
Very, very important work, and I want to come back and talk a little bit about the urgency of addressing the climate crisis. But let's move on to Shaq Koyok first. Also a regular on my talk show, Shaq. Good morning. Let's hear a little bit about the work that you're doing. Shaq Koyok is a contemporary artist and activist of the Indigenous Temuan tribe of Selangor. Shaq, tell us about what you hope to achieve through your work.
Hi, everybody. Good morning. Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me and having me today. Yes, I didn't do much of work directly. I just do best I can to help others, especially to Indigenous people, because in Malaysia itself, Indigenous people is a very minority community. And even though we have a small population in Malaysia, but we still have a lot of discrimination toward our development, toward our the voice. Our voice is still not there yet. And even now, you constantly see me only, right? I feel like it's not really, it's not fair to others. I think I'm sure there's a lot of young Indigenous people who can speak like me, and I hope someday you guys can invite others. I think it's good for others to see the mind of Indigenous people, and especially in this day, because we don't have the so-called obstacle or border that prevent us to speak, to prevent us to say what we want to say, especially in the narrative of Malaysians and Malaysia itself. You can see that we still have a lack of a representation of Indigenous people in terms of our story, in terms of our culture, and of course, our history never been told properly to anybody. That's actually create so much misinformation and a misunderstanding. The misunderstanding will create so much of a general stereotype toward Orasli and the racism toward Orasli, and then the bully cases will start in the school because of lack information of Indigenous people. I think it's all because of lack of information, and that's the thing I really try to address in my work, and try to brought that question to the general society and create the awareness among ourselves, because it's not just I don't blame to the government, I don't blame anybody, but I think we need to work together and create the change. It's not just one body can do this change, but we all together need to do our part to tell everybody about about our neighbor, for example, our state people, the whole nation itself, because I feel like Orasli, especially in Peninsula, we still have a lot of things to catch up. So we still have left so many community in Peninsula. The Orasli still not properly presented, properly mentioned, properly developed, and so on. It's become so hard for us to focusing on our education, our health, and so on.
All right, Shaq, we're going to take some time in this conversation to kind of focus on some of the challenges, particularly as you talked about stereotyping and a lack of understanding and information, just a general lack of information about Indigenous communities in Peninsula as well as in Sabah and Sarawak. So we'll talk about that. And I do want to say though that you have you've done so much to kind of set a path to talking about these things in mainstream media as well. And you're right, we should have a cohort of young Indigenous speakers to share their stories and their challenges, and we hope to build that in the coming years and the decade. So let's move on finally to our fourth panelist. We have Dr. Aizan Sofia Amin, advocate for people with disabilities. She's also senior lecturer at UKM. Dr. Aizan, tell us a little bit about, so you have won multiple awards, but let's talk a little bit about the work that you're doing and what you're championing.
Okay, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh and very good morning. How are you, Melisa?
Doing well.
Okay, all right, cool. Okay, so my name is Aizan Sofia Amin. Usually people call me Aizan. You can just call me Aizan. And I am now a senior lecturer at Universiti Kebangsaan Malaysia in social work program. So previously I was appointed as one of the member for the National Council for People with Disability by the Ministry of Women, Family and Community Development. At the same time, I'm also actively involved in volunteerism and appointed as one of the Islamic Relief Malaysia humanitarian icon. So you may check about about Islamic Relief Malaysia on our website and also social media. So I would like to share a bit about myself as a disabled person. I lost my right leg due to bone cancer when I was 16 and have become disabled since then. During my journey as a disabled person, I cried a lot, not because I had lost my right leg, but due to the unbearable structural barriers and prejudice of the society around me. I therefore decided to pursue a career in counselling to empower those with disabilities. However, during my counselling internship at a vocational centre for disabled people in Malaysia, I came across countless sad stories. Many of the people I met shared awful experiences of being stigmatized and discriminated against in society. For example, one of wheelchair user revealed that she had to quit schooling at the age of 13 because of the school failed to provide classroom on the ground floor. As a result, she ended up at the vocational center to do a tailoring course, despite her dream to become a teacher. In another case, a boy without both arms described how he wanted to support his poor family, yet no one was willing to employ him. These environmental barriers and discriminatory attitude prevented them from gaining wider access to economic and social participation. Consequently, I felt that it would be meaningless for me to empower disabled people if the welfare state and the society would not allow the empowerment to happen. Then I soon realized that counseling alone was not enough and made the crucial life transition from my counseling career to academia, joining the Department of Social Work at UKM. I believe that only through achieving expertise in disability studies, I can support disabled people on a larger scale via research and advocacy. So I completed my PhD in disability studies from the University of Glasgow in 2014. And the prospect pursuing the PhD in the UK was an eye-opener for me. I was amazed at how disabled people are equally accepted and supported by the society and the state as compared to in Malaysia. So at that time, I felt empowered and respected. And I want this to be embraced in Malaysia too. And therefore, here I am now. You can see that advocating for disabled people's rights and needs to be equally included in Malaysian society. So that's a bit about my journey, my personal journey that bring to where I am now, talking about disabled people's rights and their needs, and try to educate the society to equally accept disabled people as other people and not stigmatize or discriminated them. So that's a little bit about myself. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Aizan. Thanks. Thank you, panelists, for that introduction. Okay, folks, we're going to begin the panel proper. But before that, I'd just like to remind you, if you're watching this, feel free to send in your questions. In the true spirit of this panel, let's make this conversation truly inclusive and responsive. So send in your questions. I'll pose it to the panelists, and they can address them. But put your names down so that I know who to give credit to for the great question. If not, I will just take credit for your question, and you wouldn't want that. So feel free to put your questions down and send them across throughout the session. Let's not wait till the end. Let's keep this conversation as interactive as possible. All right. Now let's kick things off, and I want to come to Tharma first, because Tharma, you talked about building a cohort of young leaders, making them feel empowered and informed citizens and voters. But I would like to begin our conversation by looking at, this much discussed issue of disenfranchisement of young people, right? But not just the impact of the pandemic, which has been systemic, it's been deep, it's been disproportionate to young people, but also in terms of the disenfranchisement of social activism and their rights. When you speak to your peers, Tharma, is there a belief that the system has failed young people, that the burden now falls on them to change the system? Or is it the opposite? When you speak to them, are they so disillusioned and that disillusionment is so entrenched that perhaps they feel disempowered to make a difference?
Thank you very much. I have to be very honest, right? I do think that there is a big difference in terms of who you speak to, in terms of getting this sort of perspectives. I would say that a lot of young activists, because there is that element where we are more familiar with the discourse, we are more familiar with the idea of our rights, and most importantly, we are able to identify and understand that there are problems that are systemic problems, right? And therefore, in order to fix these problems, you must look at things from a systems perspective instead of just purely an individual perspective. For example, poverty is not the fault of just the individual. You're not a lazy person if you're poor, but there is issues of welfare, there's issues where there is a cycle of poverty, there's issues of a lack of opportunities. So these are all systemic issues that happen, right? There are issues where even if you're a small entrepreneur, it's difficult for you to build into a large entrepreneurship because there are established players with vested interests that have been gatekeeping certain opportunities, right? So these are all part of a system of problems that we must recognize and we must be able to fight one by one. I do think that for activists, and I'm sure many people who are listening to this and many people who are in this room who are more aware, we realize that the fight is still there, that we must strive forward. And these are the clear enemies and the clear objectives that we need to shape and reshape in order for us to have a better future. However, if we talk to the average young person, we talk to people who are somewhat aware about politics, who are not well educated about it, who are not very into the activism circle. The unfortunate reality is that there is a feeling of demotivation, of apathy, of feeling that I am powerless in this world, I'm powerless in this country, and I can't change anything. There's a real feeling about that, and it's so it's so sad and it's so difficult to change their perception, right? It's so difficult to tell them that, hey, that there is a better future that we can fight for if we are fighting the right cause. Because I think for many of them, there's a perception that, okay, I'm going out to vote, I'm going out to give, to be a part of this democratic process. But you look at the politicians, right? They don't really care about us. Or you look at the policymakers, when they do policies, they don't care about people like us. They're all out pandering to different communities that don't care about these issues, right? Or these politicians are just going out and just trying to enrich themselves. So there is this real feeling of disconnect and powerlessness. So what we try to do with UNDI 18 is this. Firstly, we by advocating, creating community champions, we hope to share this message that there is a way for you to fix things, right? It's not by investing, or it's not by hoping that this magic hero will come in and save you, right? I think for far too long in this country, we've always just continuously expected that this Superman or this hero will come in and wipe the slate clean and just save us from the from the doldrums of history, all this, basically something from the novel, right, or something from a fantasy novel. But reality is a bit more complicated than that. And what we really need to do is to be able to identify what are specific issues or what are specific problems we want to solve together and work towards solving that specific issue. So for example, with UNDI 18, we didn't try to be, we weren't egoistic enough to think we could change everything. We started off with something very specific, which was to lower the voting age in Malaysia, started very specifically. And just by luck, we also got 2 other constitutional amendments happening at the same time, right? We fought for 1 and we got 3, right? So that tends to be how things happen. So which is why I always say, right, identify what are the particular issues that you are passionate about, that you want to advocate for, whether it is anti-corruption, whether it is climate environmentalism, whether it is biodiversity, whether it is race relations, women's empowerment. There are a huge variety of issues in this world, and all of us need to play our part together in fighting for that particular issue and raising awareness on that on those ideas. And I think these are the things that we always advocate for, because when we are able to have different people fighting for a variety of different issues, when you come together, it creates a larger systemic solution to the kind of problems that we're facing together as a society. And I think when we bring together this message that these are the concrete actions that you can take, and we are not saying this as politicians, we are saying this as average young people, just like you and me, right? I can promise you that my family is not super well connected. I'm not from, my dad is not like a Dato or Tan Sri that I'm into all this. In fact, I come from a low income family. So I always say, if I can do this, I think more of us should believe that there is power, there is opportunity, that we can also work on this change together. So I think that is the message that we will always try to share, that that these are the systemic issues that need to be fixed. And there's so many systemic issues, so we need to start working on this together instead of waiting and for this magic person to come and save us, because that's never going to happen. And I think that feeling of disenfranchisement, of anger, of frustration is that when they realize that there is so much complexity in the world, and there really isn't something as simple as you just voting for the right person. It's really about democracy, is in the end about active citizenship, where each of us must be the heroes of our own lives and of our own countries. And that's really how you solve things. So that I do think that message has been quite useful in changing people's perspective. But again, I have to be honest, we cannot reach out to everyone. And there is still that feeling that things are not enough, and there's genuine apathy and genuine frustration.
Right. It takes a while, because the disillusionment is entrenched. So it takes a while to break that. And you're absolutely right about the kind of savior complex that we have in Malaysia. Maybe we watch too many Marvel Avenger movies and we expect superheroes to save us. But let's come to Nadiah, because I do want to talk about this burden that falls on young people. And I acknowledge that climate activism is intergenerational. But you have to marvel at how young people have mobilized climate action in the face of the climate emergency. So let's talk about this last generation that can end climate change, that falls disproportionately on young people, and young people who will bear the brunt of our inaction today. How are you, just taking Tharma's point, how are you working to build kind of concrete solutions within the community, particularly as you're thinking about action today, but the people in power may not have the sense of urgency that young people feel is necessary?
Hi. So yeah, the question is quite long.
You can break it up, Nadiah.
So I'm just thinking, this story about how the younger generation has always been the sort of transformational power to change to drive social causes here in Malaysia, overall around the world. This is such a huge burden, I would say. I think when I first came into the climate, so to speak, scene, people has always viewed young people as a very hot-headed, young blood, hot-headed person. We don't listen to reason, but this is exactly what the global climate movement is doing right now. We are reversing that, because we know there are enough solutions. There are already scientists, consensus of science that talks about how we can solve this, using, equity as the driver, but that's not being heard. So that's the problem. The systemic problem talks about the lack of political will here in Malaysia. So I am very much, I echo with what Tharma said. There needs to be that political shift, right? So we need to, the younger generation has to start participate in all these electoral processes. We need to understand where our democratic power lies. Because rather than just pushing for, I'm not saying that I'm against recycling, all this cleaning up, etc. Those are really good, but we need to also tackle this systemic why is this happening? Because I don't think that in another 50 years there will be another another group doing cleaning up. that's pretty much pointless, right? So that's why it's really important that any sort of changes, any sort of action that young people do, they must seek this transformational change. I hope that's all.
Well, okay, so if I could just follow up, I just want to ask you, I mean, when we talk about kind of climate action, particularly with young people, you think of the Greta Thunbergs of the world, right? And it seems to be sometimes activism or social activism often is very Klang Valley centric. It often carries a Western narrative and often, excludes people on the basis of language. And access. Can we talk a little bit about that? How do you ensure that your social activism is truly inclusive, that it's not just focused to a certain group of people who are aware about what sustainable development goals are, who are aware about the climate crisis? Nadiah.
I think it's really important that we confront this issue of injustice. And the work that we do is we try to provide as much as spaces, not in terms that we provide, but we seek collaboration with these vulnerable people, with people that does not have the same sort of understanding of climate change, of climate crisis itself, and try to incorporate them, empowering them together, working with us and bringing all these changes. And I think from the previous projects that we did, I just have to tell you guys this story. There's so much unlearning, relearning, those kind of processes happening, even amongst activists, and most of our activists coming from urban spaces, more privileged people, to bring down all this information to the most vulnerable. But and when we came to that space, right, we thought that, hey, we are bringing all this information, but towards the end, we realized that, hey, it's a sharing sort of platform. We are learning more from the vulnerable communities, right, that they don't only, enter this space as vulnerable people, but they also offer solutions. So this is where, the indigenous knowledge and community-led solutions must be part of policy making. These are the voices that we must center. I think, the concept of passing the mic, throwing the rope, and then, bringing everyone over, it's really important that we understood where our privilege is, and to include this, the solutions from the ground up, and then for it to meet halfway with the top-down policy making. I think, we can do this in various ways through education. I think Tharma has spoken so many times about, empowering, giving, respecting youth leadership. This is where it starts.
Okay. Yeah. All right. So, Shaq, Nadiah talked about, working together with indigenous communities, right? As stakeholders, not as a marginalized or vulnerable group. So let's talk a little bit about that. We've got a question from Kon Onsian, who's saying that, Orang Asli are arguably the most important partners to combat climate change. How do we best mobilize and support Orang Asli to conserve the forest and fight climate change? So let's talk about that. I mean, young Orang Asli, how are they? Do they feel like they have rights? Do they feel like they have a voice, that they are being heard? Shaq?
I think the problem is, like Nadiah said, and there's not much space for the indigenous people. Not just we haven't talked about the use of indigenous people itself. The space for indigenous people quite limited in our society now. But in the work that we done before, we known about the word of climate justice, climate change. We protect the nature, protect the jungle long time ago until now. I think that work is in our gene, in our culture. It is part of our religion. It is part of our lifestyle. Protecting the nature is a part of the knowledge that been passed down for many generations from our ancestors, and that itself people should admire. That itself, I think, the Malaysian society, I think the world society need to learn from indigenous people instead just putting more Western agenda on indigenous knowledge, because we have that knowledge already. As the only thing I think we need to do, I think not only thing, but so many things we need to do with Orang Asli, just giving some space, giving some place for us to speak in behalf of Orang Asli and tell a story about our history, our culture. I think that's very important because that is will benefit to anybody. It's not just Orang Asli, it benefit the whole society of Malaysia, because that idea of a sustainability of indigenous lifestyle is very easy to follow if you learn a little bit of animism in Orang Asli itself. Is we very much center our religion toward the nature. Without nature, our religion cannot continue, basically like that. So and also there's so many things we can learn how the indigenous people can survive without proper modern facility and so on. But at the same time, we living in 2021 and we still need everybody need to have a proper facility. And it's same to say that Orang Asli in Malaysia, especially in Peninsula, still have some community have no proper facility, especially road, water, electricity. They still live in the dark. Some of them it's so hard for them to go to school and so on. And that's quite a shame to know that we in 2021 still have the community live as that. Even though we have small population, we should just tackle that kind of issue because we have a very small population of Orang Asli in Malaysia. I think that's another thing that I think quite lack in our society, and we need to together to have being up together in the same level as others.
Yeah, and it's this, because it's such a small community. You're absolutely right. I mean, in 2021, we're seeing still such deprivation for Orang Asli communities, particularly in the Peninsula Malaysia. Maybe because, as you say, there's no space, there's no visibility. We're not giving space for their voices to be heard. And speaking about being given space, I want to stay on this topic about youth culture, but I want to look at it from the dimension of people with disabilities. Dr. Aizan, can we focus on whether, mainstream youth culture, which is one that equates youth with health, with energy, with full mobility, with perfection of the body, has that been a barrier of inclusion for young people with disabilities to participate in society, to fulfill their potential, fulfill their personhood, and fulfill their rights?
Yeah. In regard to that question, I think that we have to think from how the way people think about disabled people. Because in our society, we always have two types of thinking. The first one, we might see disabled people from the medical or the traditional approach model, whereby we see that disabled people, they have the problem lies within themselves because they are disabled, so they cannot do much or they cannot do what other people do. And from other perspective, from the social model, the problem lies not within the individual, but lies within the society. The society who make them unable to participate and to get access to life. So that's how disabled people themselves, they embrace the belief that they are disabled, therefore they are unable to be part of the social movement, to be part of the mainstream society. So that's why we are the activists of disabled people. We always want to empower them to look that the problem lies within the social barriers, not themselves, not that they are having difficulties or limitation because of their impairment, but because of the society fail to provide the access to them. So we want to educate people that it's not that disabled people have impairment or limitation, but because of the society fail to provide the infrastructure, fail to provide the services, fail to provide the education that is accessible to them, that fail to provide the employment opportunities that can be participated by disabled people. That's why we also at the same time work with twin track approach, whereby we educate the society about to change their mindset from medical or traditional model to social model that looks that the problem lies within the society, that pose the social barriers toward disabled people, that makes disabled people unable to get participate in the social movement or in the society. Yeah.
Okay. Can I follow up on that, because you talked a little bit about employment opportunities, and I do want to ask that because that is also a significant part of people with disabilities having financial security, having meaningful work, and I'm just wondering whether you've seen inclusion, particularly in the private sector and in employment for people with disabilities, particularly maybe they face issues when having access to work or looking for work.
Yes, that's always our problem all the time. And we have worked on this so many years, but still until now, the employment opportunities for disabled people are very limited. For example, in the government sector, we have 1% quota policy. In the JPA, we have in public sector, we have 1% quota for disabled people as a public servant. However, until now, because the policy have been introduced in 2010, in 2009, even then. But until now, in 2021, more than 10 years, still the 1% quota policy still doesn't fulfill as yet, because only from 40 agencies in the government sectors, only 4 out of 40 government agencies have fulfilled the 1% quota of having disabled workers in their agency. So that's in the government sectors. What about in the private or corporate sectors? Because we don't have the statistic of those who being employed by the private or corporate sectors. We cannot provide the statistic because we don't have that comprehensive policy that gather all the information, because in government sectors as well, we still don't have that
Are you saying that there's no data on the employment opportunities for people with disabilities? There's no transparent data available?
Yes, there's no complete data on that.
Okay, that is very disconcerting to discover. Can I ask Shaq, since we're on the topic of jobs, Shaq, when young Indigenous people I think migration is one of the big issues when it comes to the Indigenous communities. They migrate to towns for jobs and education. How should we be thinking about economic opportunities and financial stability for the Indigenous community in Peninsular Malaysia?
I think it's a similar problem as well, because in terms of migration for the getting different job and a better job, and it's quite hard for Indigenous people. But it takes quite some time to Indigenous people to adjust to the new environment. For example, especially like me, because I was living in a village for a long time, and then have to go to the boarding school in the school, and then that it just the time for me to adjust to a new lifestyle quite hard, and that is I can see the others who taking the job in the city, they have a trouble to have a different way of life and a different environment. It's not just that; it's opportunity. It's quite rare for Indigenous people, and it's so hard for orang asli who live in a village that doesn't have a proper network, phone network or any internet network for them to have of course to apply for the job itself. If you don't have a phone network, it's so hard for them to get the job that they wanted. So they almost force themselves to go to the city to apply for the job and to get a job, and then if they got a job and they have to move away from the village, and and that also quite hard for some community because they so loving the idea communal lifestyle.
I understand. So Shaq, when young orang asli move out of their home, their village, their community, and then move to cities for jobs and opportunities in education, is there pressure for assimilation? Do they feel the cultural and identity tensions that young Indigenous people feel because they have severed a connection to language and culture in a city that disregards orang asli, that disregards the identity and heritage of orang asli? Yes,
there is a lot of problem in especially the racism and stereotyping and then discrimination, and often I heard so many of the orang asli they even have to pretend they are Malay to not being bullied, to not being become a scapegoat or anything, because they're so afraid. Soon they say they are orang asli, people start treat them differently. People start make fun of them, and the person or orang asli person himself end up feeling I need to they need to have the job to take care of the family. If they get the negative impact for them, is also it's not good for their health, not good for their mental health for them. And that is even if I heard a similar story that orang asli they cannot face working in that job anymore because they face so many racism and bullying and so on, and that create other orang asli other orang asli to find a strategic way for them to address their orang asli. And even me, I have tried to give them some lot of advices how to tackle on this problem, because sometimes it's quite worrying, to know that other Malaysian treat other Malaysian certain way, and I find that it's quite hard. And sometimes I think it's all because the lack of information of indigenous people. That is what the cause of this problem.
Lack of information, meaning you wish that it was addressed in our education system?
Yes.
There is no information. We don't learn when we were in school. There's nothing in history textbooks, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. All right. I'm going to take a couple of questions. All the questions are coming through. Thank you so much for sending them. These are tough questions. I have to admit, really good questions. Keep them coming through. I'm going to pose a couple, and I'm going to put you, Tharma, on the spot. Apologies for a couple of tough questions. I'm going to combine two. One from Jay Sharma, who I'm going to paraphrase the question a little bit. He reckons, I think, the fact that, wonderful that the panelists have brought up issues of the state of the planet, of race and inequality, as well as gender and sexuality, but how much of this is shared by the mainstream of the country? How much of this is, similar vision is shared by the masses of the country? That is one part of the question. And I'm going to combine that with another question by Amelina Davis, who says that brain drain has been a long-standing issue in Malaysia, and that the recent political upheavals has further exacerbated this. So instead of staying to rebuild the nation, many youth are disenchanted and prefer to migrate. How do we convince the youth to remain and be part of a better Malaysia, bearing in mind that this is a privileged set of youth who can consider leaving the country? Tharma.
All right. I think firstly, those are great questions, very, very relevant, and also not very difficult, not very easy to answer, right? If you think about it, because answering it this requires to recognize that there are things that are very problematic. There are things that are very difficult to solve. So, for example, the issue of are people in general, right? Because we always talk about these issues, for example, gender, sexuality, environmentalism, even to the extent of anti-corruption, things that you assume are quite well known, right? Like you assume that anti-corruption is something that everyone should be on board, right? But the reality is that it's really we really exist in information bubbles, right? There are people who have completely different worldviews compared to us, and the reality is that these people, these communities are, I would say, even if they're not the majority in terms of numbers, they because in the end a lot of urbanites are aware about these issues, and if you look at our demographics, a lot of urbanites, just people in urban centers are the majority in this country. However, the people who do hold democratic power, people who are in rural areas, the vast majority of them are not aware of these issues, do not think these things are important, and in fact, for them, their priorities in the world are really quite different, right? For them, what matters more, I think, is firstly very core bread and butter issues, right? So for them, it's quite, I would say that it is a very immediate perspective on what's necessary. For example, if I have cash in hand, that's more valuable than creating a system where I can get a better job, or creating a system where if I do if I have a entrepreneurship, or if I have a business, I'm able to grow that business and then become wealthy myself, right? So having that cash in hand or that immediate welfare is more valuable than developing a better system. Or the issues of, for example, gender, sexuality, and all that stuff is always going to be subservient to religious and cultural norms, right? And these things are always going to be their biggest priority. And that's really the cleavage that we see in our country at the moment. So we do have to recognize this, and we do have to try to change people's perspectives. So for UNDI 18, as an organization, we are very, I think we've been very aware about this difference for a long time, because when we do engagements with young people and we educate them and we speak to them, and the things that for us, we try our best to be as bipartisan as possible. So we don't just speak to people who are pro-political parties in urban centers. It's so important to do engagement with people who are UMNO supporters, PAS supporters, Bersatu supporters. Even you look at PH supporters outside of the Klang Valley, they have very, very different priorities, right? Very much, even if and I just want to point out that there's a perception that race centricism or religious centricism or the lack of understanding for reforms only happens on one side of the political aisle. I'll tell you for a fact that that's not the case, right? When you go outside of urban centers, the priorities really differ, and their understanding of what matters is very, very different, right? On both sides of the political aisle. So what we try to do to the best of our abilities is firstly to ensure that when we do when we do programs, we always make sure that it is in as much as possible, we do it in Malay, to ensure that there is a larger reach, and to make sure that it's not just your English-speaking groups that are able to understand and appreciate this content, right? I think this is the first part that we do. And also, like recently, we had Kami to come in and educate young environmentalists in Malay about litigasi awam or public litigation, right? So I think these are things where we do cross organization collaboration for the sake of educating the public. So that's the first part. The second thing that we actively work on is developing community champions. So that's why we have Parliament Digital, we have Dewan Muda Malaysia, we have Fellow Parliament, we have all these programs. But people always assume that it's just about creating young leaders. Of course, that's an important aspect, but also a very important strategic aspect for us is if you can build these community champions and you can educate them about concepts such as institutional reforms, such as systemic issues, and these people can be change makers in their community, because it's always just about having one or two people in that community to bring forward an idea. Because often it's not really that people are against this, it's just that they have never been introduced to these ideas, it's not normalized, it's not culturalized, and therefore on their list of priorities is non-existent, because they just don't know this is a thing, right? So I think that part is quite important, and that's why we are also working on Undi Negaraku, where we're building a larger youth movement in order to try to address and try to bridge that gap. And I really urge, I think, more organizations, more parties out there, and especially people who care about these differences in values, right? Because the reality is that while we might have a liberal conservative thing where we cannot agree on some issues, right? And this is something that really is going to be quite difficult to overcome certain big differences, but there are many things that we can agree on. So I do think that on the things such as anti-corruption, things such as building better institutions, building a more accountable government, these are things that everyone can agree on. So I do think that work should be done on trying to find that unifying point, like things such as environmentalism and climate change, that those are things that can be that uniting factor too, right? But I do think that's quite, in the end, I have to admit that there's a very big difference between what we're talking about here today and what the vast majority of people are doing. And we have to do a lot of work, put in a lot of effort, and we need everyone together in order to fix and bridge that gap, right? I hope, so that's the first question. Again, I want to give credit to it because it's a very good question. The second question in terms of brain drain, I think this is also a very important issue. And for me, I mean, just reflectively, I have to say that in the end, it's really about you having the best amount of life, the best quality of life possible, right? I think that's really why we live in this world sometimes, that we want to try to do what's best for ourselves, our family, and also want to be able to live in the best manner possible. So I do think that people who are relatively privileged will take the opportunity to go off and try to go overseas. But the reality is that for the vast majority of us, right, we choose this country, and this country is something that we have an emotional attachment to. Like, for example, myself, I studied overseas, but I could have easily gotten a job overseas and decided not to come back. But I do realize that this is my homeland, right? This is something that I have an emotional attachment to, and this is where my family is. This is where, I'm familiar with. This is where, there's culture, there's language, there's history that I love, right? So because of that idea, or because of that, I guess, that sense of love, right? You do want to contribute back, and you do want to build it. But I guess the big question that I'm trying to answer, and I think many more people should try to answer, is that how do we contribute back in a manner that makes sense? Because, and it goes back to the question just now also, right? Why do we feel powerless? Why do we feel disenfranchised? Why do we feel frustrated? Because in the end, we feel that even if I want to do something, if I want to express my love, express my enthusiasm, express my, my nationalism and patriotism, there's no avenue for me to do so, right? Because people like me are considered second-class citizens, or people like me are considered not respected, or there are people within the hegemons of power that don't want to let go, right? So I don't think that this is the core issue that we have to try to address together. And for me, I think my advice is that, yes, there is going to be a brain drain, and there is going to continue to be a brain drain. But the important thing is that for those who are aware, right, and this again, I advocate this, right, for those who are aware, those who are familiar with these issues, we have to try to actively work on these issues together. Speak to your, policymakers, try to educate the public as much as possible, and most importantly, use your voice. Right? Because in this realm of social media, it's not just a small minority of people who own the media that have a voice, right? When we started UNDI 18, we were nobodies, right? But yet we managed to build a nationwide movement. I do believe that all of us have the opportunity because of the democratization of the voice via social media. So let's talk about these issues. Let's educate ourselves. And most importantly, for the issues of brain drain, the issues of solving problems in this country, and also bridging that gap, let's not just think it's the responsibility of young people or the responsibility of certain communities only. It's something that we have to work towards solving this together, because sometimes young people don't have the resources. We have the energy, enthusiasm. We don't have the financial resources. We don't have the money. We don't have the time, for example. So when you have intergenerational collaboration, that's how we fix things together. Again, I'm trying to end with a message of hope instead of a message of despair.
I appreciate that.
Because it's so easy to despair. But let's work together, and let's hope, and let's continue pushing, because that's really what we have to do. And that's really often our only option, right? Otherwise, we just have to give up. Yeah.
Well, I appreciate that you ended on a message of hope, and it is very easy to despair for sometimes when you think that there is, you're not feeling very empowered to make a difference in this country. But again, I take your point about social media and how that has democratized action, right? So we often we often dismiss social media as frivolous or superficial, but Nadiah, Kami has used social media for concrete action. You've rallied support, you've organized a movement. I do want to talk a little bit about social media. Maybe you can inject that into your conversation, but I also want to ask you about the gendered lens to climate action, because I know that's something that you work on a lot. You were part of the women's gender consultancy that recently ended COP26. And I want to talk about that. How do we make that dimension of climate action normalized and part of the public consciousness?
Right. So when we first entered this climate scene, we didn't really thought about this, right? We know these are happening, but we live in such a, like Tharma said, in such a bubble. We don't actually realize that we are internalizing this, embodying this. But then the pandemic happened. So when the pandemic happened, we realized that we started, me and Shaq, we started this thing called Misi Bantu OA. And then we realized that most of the people that we spoke to are men. And then we also realized that, the aid that was being dispersed by NGOs, by the government, they don't include this specific women's needs, young women's needs, baby formula, Pampers, sanitary pads, and etc. And then when we start sending all these items, and we start getting responses from these women who realize that, hey, we need to be there, we need to speak up, otherwise we wouldn't get all this aid, right? So it all started from there, making them realize, hey, there's a relevance in them speaking out. Because otherwise, when we come in and with the idea of, feminism and all these big words, they wouldn't understand. They just need to find their role, how their role plays a part in community organizing and in building communities. This is where it's really important. And then coming back to your question, actually, I'm really interested to answer to comment a bit on Tharma's point. Please. About like brain drain, right? It's incredible, within the next 10 years we will see huge migration of human beings around the world. It's not because only for political ataupun economic reason, but also climate is a big factor. Humans being how do I say this? They have to move out from their geographical habitation, right? So it is already changing the landscapes of understanding the dynamics of displaced communities, why people move out, why migration and all this sort of thing happened. And just to put it out there, a 1 degree Celsius of temperature rise will displace around 1 billion people. So these are data, UN data. And we have not even grabbed that idea about climate security, our border security, all the sort of thing that everything, these communities they are already into poverty, and they are now compounded by the extreme weather events. And this made their homes inhabitable, livelihood untenable, and pushed them out, right? So I think, either we want to accept it or not, but this crisis will induce this domestic migration all across Southeast Asia. If we don't deal with that, not only with the brain drain and stuff, it's just like, how do we have this shared of understanding, regional understanding, that we are in this together, right. We can't continue all these damn competitions and stuff like that. We have to work on cooperation. This will further destabilize the region. Yeah. And just to add, Malaysia has a very poor human rights record. We apathy and crackdown of marginalized migrants and refugees communities. These have demonstrated the cultural sort of challenges that we see, including language of migration, security, human rights. How do we include that in any sort of policies that will be impacted by the climate change, including those brain drains? Where are we going to get the brains doing all this? These are just putting out there because it's such a disconcerting question about migration itself. And social media, maybe I can we don't have time for that.
We can come back to the social media question again. You're right about looking at the impact from multiple dimensions, and often we fail to consider all the different ways that the climate crisis may impact different communities, the intersectionality of that. And on that note, I want to come to Dr. Aizan. We talked. You brought up a few issues about lack of data, lack of representation for people with disabilities, and I just wonder again, the question that I posed to Nadiah, whether that might apply to you, to PWDs, whether there is a gender dimension when it comes to the challenges that are faced by people with disabilities. Do women with disabilities, do they face more difficulties in the, in both the kind of public sphere as well as the private sphere?
Yes, definitely. Because I did my PhD research on disabled women's lived experiences in Malaysia. So from 33 women that I interviewed, so they shared a lot of stories that I have never imagined. The first one in terms of accessibility, so I think that's also happened to disabled men. And then in terms of gendered experiences, for example, to be a disabled woman also, they face challenges to show that they are a woman. For example, one of my informants said that when she was a child, her mother prevented her from wearing a skirt because by wearing a skirt shows that she's a girl who is weak. So she always wearing a pant because her mother doesn't want her to be portrayed as a girl and with disability. So it added another layer of disadvantages, being a girl and being a disabled. So and then when she grew up, she become like a boy because she was prevented from being a girl, from being a woman. And then also in terms of portraying their identity as a woman, because for example, one of my informants said that she always felt that she wasn't like other women because she liked to wear beautiful clothes, wearing high heel, but because she has physical impairment, she couldn't wear the high heel, put on the beautiful dress because she is on a wheelchair. So the society portrayed that being a girl, you have to wear beautiful clothes, put on high heel shoes. So that's make disabled people feel disadvantaged. And another issues that I found that is the sexual abuse happen towards disabled women that I interviewed. Especially when they want to get the medical treatment from the traditional healers, because that's our culture that I believe that most of us, at least once in our lifetime, we get some medical treatment like massage or like pawang or whatever, that Shaq knows better because that's very dominant in our culture, that we also acknowledge the importance of traditional treatment. So when disabled women, they become disabled, for example, they get into accident and they become paralyzed, and then because the parents, they don't want their child to be permanently disabled, so although the doctors have identified them as disabled and they cannot recover from the impairment, but the parents still want to look their children's being normal. This is how the society shape how we think being a disabled is not normal.
Right.
So
Dr. Aizan, if I may interrupt and follow up on that, has that something to do? You talked about the societal culture, but I'm just wondering whether that has been to do with the fact that there's been such a lack of positive representation of people with disabilities in mainstream media, in popular culture, in the films, in the movies that we watch.
Because we
mostly, it's mostly an object of pity or deserving of pity, not empowered, not a person.
True.
How do we go about changing that? Because that is such a big influence in the way we think and the way we see society, right?
So that's true. In our media, we portray that disabled people as a weak pity, and it was always that we portray disabled people in the movie or drama, like Malay drama, like when you do sin, you get kifara, and then you become disabled. You got into accident and you become disabled. That's how we portray that being disabled as a punishment. So that's why people doesn't want to be associated as being disabled. They cannot accept the fact. Some of the parents couldn't accept the fact that the children is a disabled. And then how we can counter this? We have to include disabled people in any form of media or representation, just like other people. For example, in our movie, in our drama, in our forum, or in whatever we do, we just include disabled people as just like other people. We don't segregate them, we don't exclude them. So, for example, if people used to see that disabled people are everywhere, for example, in a drama, like the main actress maybe eating at the restaurant, and we can see at the restaurant there's a customer who is disabled. It's become a norm that we include them in our daily life. So when people used to see that image, so they know that disabled people are everywhere and we should be friends with them. So what makes people afraid to get in touch with disabled people? Because they don't have the exposure. Because at school, for example, we have special education, but the special education is not inclusive education. It's just that putting special class in mainstream school. But what about the environment? Whether all the students integrated with that special students, or they only put the special school class at the mainstream school, and then other students they just do their own activities, not integrating with that disabled students. So that's how I look that we lack of exposure to disabled people. That's why our knowledge about disabled people and experience with disabled people are very limited, and people have little knowledge about disabled people, and they are afraid to get to be friends with them, to mingle with them, and therefore they have stigma. They have negative stigma towards disabled people, and the stigma tend to be discrimination.
Exactly. Excellent point. I thank you for raising that, and now I shall be more conscious, more mindful that when I watch anything, and if I see discrimination in that way of portraying a person with disabilities, I shall change the channel, turn it off immediately. All right, Shaq, I want to ask you whether you can weigh in on this, because again, Indigenous communities are actually also been the at the receiving end of harmful stereotypes. You see tropes of Indigenous people almost always included. An Indigenous person is not just a person, but an Indigenous person, often in costume on camera. How do we ensure that this is changed in mainstream media? Do you have any thoughts about how we can include Indigenous communities without singling them out?
Yes, I think first of all is you have to allow and give a space for Indigenous people to be there, to represent themselves. And you're right. Even myself, I've seen so many of funny people using Orasli as a traditional clothes, as a costume for them to make themselves to be known, to make themselves, I saw some of the traditional dance been danced by the big festival in Malaysia. I saw some of the dance quite inappropriate, and then even they don't present the right movement of that, and some that actually will affect the stereotype of people toward orang asli especially, and then that actually will create some misinformation about orang asli. And I'm agree that we need to start with telling the story about orang asli first from orang asli people, not just from the outside the voice, from outside the people, because we need the first experience people who speak who can better speak about themselves than other second people.
Okay, all right. I think that also kind of answers the question that Nadiah Ali posed a little bit earlier. If I may just read the question, she said, "Thank you, Shaq, for shedding light on orang asli discrimination issues. I don't think this is a new issue," Nadiah says, "but representation matters. So other initiatives," so she's asking, what other initiatives do you think can mainstream media or government agencies do to address this issue effectively? Shaq, what would you like to see? You said a bit about, letting orang asli, so including orang asli in the conversation. What else can government agencies do, Shaq?
Yes, first of all, introduce the history of orang asli in our history education system, especially in the primary school and secondary school. I just put one chapter about indigenous people, because we need to learn from 1 to 10. We cannot just skip to 10. We need to learn from 1, 2, 3, 4. It's so simple as that. So if you just miss a part of the history of Malaysia, we doesn't know anything. We almost like we lack of knowledge about our own culture. And so it's so strange for me. A lot of people they got to know about K-pop, the what's it called, the boy band, what do you call it? But they don't know anything about their own people. That's even weird for me, and that's the thing I think we need to tackle. It's history book talking about orang asli in the history in the education system, and also create a program about orang asli. But the program itself need to have orang asli behind this program. Is actually direct the story and then tell the story, even produced by the orang asli. I'm sure Nadiah have a good team. I seen one movie created by the woman, orang asli woman. They create a beautiful film about them, about their story. I think that's show is how creative the orang asli, how space, creating the space for asli created a better better solution on tackling this misinformation and a lack of representation. Because lack of representation, you need to put presentations there. You need to put real people in there.
Real representation, right?
Exactly.
Not just cultural appropriation. That does not make it okay to have a token representation there. Thank you, Shaq, and guys, thank you so much for all the questions. I mean, such great questions coming in from the audience today. Tough questions, and questions that I think reflect a real desire to move forward. What can we do? What can we change? How can we change the country? How can we achieve better social justice? Which is essentially the point of this panel discussion, the title of it being Looking Forward to 2030. And in the last few minutes that we have left, I want to kind of go around with the panelists and ask them about what it is that they hope that will be achieved in this next decade, and what can be done, particularly what can we do as an individual, as a society, as an informed voter. And again, 9 years, that's not that long of a time period, but it can be enough to see the needle move on some material change, both in terms of policy and both in terms of society. So guys, panelists, if we were to envision 2030, now imagine we're, fast forward to 2030, I'm wondering what one structural policy change you would like to see in place by 2030. And the other thing is, for us watching, watching you guys, what is it that we want? What one societal mindset change would you like us to internalize and change? Let's start with Tharma.
Right. So let me get this right. Is one policy change and one societal cultural change,
Correct.
right?
Yeah. So one policy change. So what can the government change, and then what can society change?
Okay, got it. All right. I think the next 10 years, right, or up to 2030 is so pivotal, is so unbelievably important for Malaysia because really time is running out. And you're talking about the climate crisis, but you're also talking about our economic situation in the first place, right? Countries are catching up to us within our region. And we're competing for talent, we're competing for capital, and these are all things that our advantages are slipping away. So we do have to have urgent action within this next few years if we want to sort of save Malaysia and make sure that this is a place that will prosper for the next 50, 100 years, right? So I think for me, the biggest policy change that must happen is that we must improve our democratic systems, especially the Electoral Commission and also Parliament, to ensure that it's more representative, it is less divided, it is there is less gerrymandering, less malapportionment, less unfairness in our system. And essentially the idea is this, that we must ensure that the people that we vote is representative of society instead of what we have right now, where it is very skewed, where one part of society has 5 to 6 times more voting power than people, for example, in urban centers, for example, right? These are things that I really hope will be solved, and we have to solve it very quickly. And I think this is a key priority choice or policy choice for me. I think number two, in terms of what are the cultural changes that we need to have, I just think that the most important thing is that Malaysia needs to embrace that we are a diverse country, right? I think that's the part that I hope that I just don't understand why people cannot regard that. I think there are so many people who just want a mono perspective. They want assimilation. They cannot accept that, we were a country that was built on differences, right? When we brought in, when we combined together between Semenanjung, Sabah, and Sarawak, and also Singapore to form this nation together, we were bringing in different diverse perspectives. And that's something that should be celebrated instead of something that should be clamped down, right? We need to celebrate these differences of culture, of religion, of perspectives. And I think that is the key difference, that we are able to allow each other to live in peace. We allow each other to celebrate and practice diversity, yet we have this grand collective identity as a Malaysian. I think that is a key idea, to celebrate differences, but unite for the betterment of all of us together. So I hope that, I don't want to take too much time, but I think these are the two things that's important. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, those are great points, Tharma. Thank you. Aizan, can I ask you what you would like to see in place, both in terms of a policy change and a societal change?
Thank you for this great question. I'm looking forward to this. I want to see the change in the amendment to the Person with Disabilities Act 2008 by the Ministry of Women and Community and Family Development. I want to see that the act include the implementation and also penalty to those who non-compliance with the act, because currently it is being seen as a mere documentation only, without any penalty, without any implementation. It's just based on the goodwill of the society to fulfill the act, to provide the facility, to provide the service because of their goodwill, not because based on the rights of disabled people that we have to provide that facilities or that services. And also I want to see that the act include the element of anti-discrimination, as we can follow the American with Disability Act, the UK Equality Act 2010, and the Disability Discrimination Act 1992 by Australia. So if we include the element of anti-discrimination in the PWD Act, we can see a major transformation in the society, that they know that when they provide the infrastructure, the services, the facilities, it's not because of their goodwill, it's not because of on the charity basis, but because of the rights of disabled people to get that requirement or that needs. And on the second question on the societal change, I want to see that we change our mindset from the charity-based to right-based approach. that we provide the rights and the needs of disabled people, not because we're doing good thing for them, but because they have the rights. And also, if we can, and also it can educate disabled people themselves as well, that they have rights. They are not the beggars. They are not beggars for their rights, but they have the rights to strive for that. And yeah, that's what I want to see in 2030.
Excellent. Yeah. So from charity-based approach to a rights-based.
Right-based, yes.
Okay. Nadiah, let me come to you, because again, this next decade is going to be, they say it's the defining decade, right? It's the deciding decade for climate action. So this next decade is going to be incredibly crucial. What was it that you'd like to see in changes in terms of policy and mindset?
I think these two, structural policy and social mindset, they are interchangeable, right? I couldn't pick them apart. So I'm just gonna, put it in one, sure, sentence. I think, like you said, 2030 is absolutely critical, but we also need to think about what happens beyond 2030, right? So a structural change that I would really like to see happening in our policy making is we must continue to strive to move beyond GDP, to measure the well-being of our people and the planet, and it does not only have to happen. It does not only have to happen here in Malaysia, but all over the world, globally, because the concept of infinite growth is archaic, it's deeply flawed. Even GDP is something, a construct that was was being, constructed sometime in the 20th century. But now, after the pandemic, we realize that, this is no longer work for us, right? Because we can't continue putting profit and unequal wealth distribution as a driver of this country. And therefore, we need to deconstruct that meaning of development, what development means in Malaysia, because we need to move away from those extractives. We have been seeing land. Okay, this is the mindset that I'm trying to put inside, because we've been seeing land as a property of the state. As we confront all this institutional, patriarchal, capitalism, racism, we realize that this development model has destroyed our world and our connection to nature and with each other. So we must reclaim what land means, right? And then we don't own land, but it's the other way around. We belong to the land. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So this is something that I like to see, and definitely, please reject false and harmful responses to climate change that fail to address root causes. And the time is now. We have to put out the fire, guys. So because there's no other better time than now. Let's rebuild. We must rebuild.
I hear your urgency, Nadiah, and I hope that it filters to everyone watching today. Yeah. Shaq, we come to you. What would you like this next decade to address in terms of Indigenous community rights?
Yes, I agree with Dr. Aizan, because we need to move away from charitable kind of to a very systematic changing and orally. And also I want to eliminate all the, using orally as a photo op for the charity event and so on. I think that's really not helping the Indigenous community, and they will create so much of a stereotype around us that we are almost like a beggar, we are almost like a vulnerable community, almost they will create some other CSR mission by other big corporate big corporate companies, so they can wash off their sin. So they put that to use the Indigenous vulnerable community as a target for them to make them look good. And that's I need to change that. And of course, like I said earlier, we need to start from the beginning. We need to start about the history of Asli, story of Asli. Need to be I want our education system to change. I want to see the Asli story in the history book of our education system. I think I think it's not a big job. I think that's is achievable, and I want every Orasli given opportunity to speak in this kind of forum and in any media. I want to see Orasli to be there. I want to see the movie of Orasli. I want to see the program of Orasli, the community university, and that's I think progressive. I want that progressive change, and I was society, because we need to move together forward. If we move forward without the vulnerable community, without the marginal community, I think we're not gonna move. We still stuck where we are now. We need to bring all community together to move forward.
And the idea is that we will move towards better social justice in 2030. Folks, thank you so much for staying until the end of this discussion and for sending in all those really wonderful questions. You've really made me worried for my job, might put me out of a job by asking such insightful questions. I also want to say that the topic of this panel is really about inclusivity and imagining a better future. And if we, in the past 90 minutes, allowed you to become aware about the social injustice or learn about discrimination or marginalization that's happening in our country today, then we have done our job today, made you a little bit more aware and work towards that future that we can envision for a better Malaysia. So on that note, I want to thank our wonderful panelists for being so candid and insightful and sharing their stories and spending time today. It's been an honor and my pleasure to chat to you today. Thank you for your time, and thank you everyone for staying till the end, and to Yayasan Hasanah for having us as part of this event. Thank you to the organizing team. Everyone take care, and I hope to see you again. Have a wonderful afternoon, folks. See you.